I am 29 and until last year, I never gave much thought to the unseen. I lived a grounded life in the suburbs, working a standard office job, keeping my apartment tidy, and spending my weekends with my two cats, Luna and Jasper. I was particularly close to my mother, and even 3 years after she passed, I made it a point to visit her grave at the Catholic cemetery on the outskirts of town. It had always been a place of quiet reflection for me, a sanctuary, really. Last summer, a friend from college, Mark, came to visit. We spent the morning walking through the local tourist spots, enjoying the heat and the ease of a summer day. By mid-afternoon, I suggested we drive to the cemetery. I wanted to pay my respects, and I wanted Mark to see the place where I often felt most at peace. As we pulled into the gravel lot, a strange, heavy stillness settled over me. It was the kind of day where the air felt pressurized, like the moment before a violent thunderstorm that never actually breaks. My gut told me to turn the car around, but I ignored it. I walked to my mother's plot, knelt, and prayed just as I always did. Everything was normal. The marble was cool under my fingers. The birds were singing in the trees, but the unease in my chest didn't dissipate. It followed me back to the car. There's an old graveyard on the hill about 10 minutes from here, Mark said, tapping his phone map. I saw it marked as a landmark. Want to check it out? I shouldn't have said yes. I knew it, yet I nodded. The place on the hill was different. It wasn't manicured like the Catholic cemetery. It was wild, overgrown with gnarled, leafless trees and headstones that tilted at impossible angles. It was utterly, aggressively silent. No birds, no wind, just a vacuum of sound. As soon as I stepped past the iron gate, the hair on my arms stood up. It wasn't just fear. It was a biological warning signal, a primal scream from my subconscious telling me to run. We wandered deeper, my heart hammering against my ribs. We stopped near two graves tucked away in a corner, sunken into the earth, their inscriptions long ago eroded by rain. The moment I looked at them, a violent, icy chill spiked down my spine, a freezing sensation that felt like needles dragging across my skin. My breath hitched. I felt an invisible, suffocating weight pressing against my throat. I didn't say a word to Mark. One just spun on my heel and walked, then jogged back to the bike, my pulse thundering in my ears. The weight didn't leave when we got home. It was a physical, leaden exhaustion that settled into my muscles and never lifted. 2 weeks later, my car was totaled in a collision that, by all accounts, should have been fatal. I walked away with minor injuries, but the terror was only beginning. Since that day on the hill, my life has felt like a slow motion unraveling, a series of minor accidents, near misses, and an encroaching sense that something is hovering just behind my shoulder, waiting for me to falter. Desperate for an explanation, I sought out help. I first spoke to a local priest at my parish. He listened, his face grave, and after I described the incident on the hill, he told me that I had walked into a place I should have avoided, and that something, an attachment, he called it, had followed me home. Distraught, I sought a second opinion from a priest at a different congregation, hoping he might dismiss it as superstition. He didn't. He told me the same, that I was carrying a darkness that was feeding on my anxiety. The nights have become the worst. My dreams are no longer dreams. They are vivid, terrifying visions. I see myself dying in endless, repetitive ways. One night, I dreamt I was in my own living room. The air was thick, like sludge. I watched in horror as Luna and Jasper began to move erratically, their eyes turning glassy, then black, before they turned on me with a hatred that felt ancient. My family was there in the dream, praying, but as they knelt, their voices shifted into something guttural and wrong, their faces twisting until they, too, were consumed by the same void. We all died in that house, trapped. In another, I am with my late mother. She is walking through a mist, leading me toward a Buddhist monk, but the path is slick with blood. Before we reach him, I look to my side and see a gruesome road accident, the same one I keep reliving. I wake up sweating, gasping for air, clutching my sheets in the dark. My cats often sit at the foot of my bed, staring at the corner of the room, their ears swiveled toward nothing, growling at the empty space. I have started leaving the lights on. I don't know what I brought back from that hill, or if it was always there, waiting for me to trip. I just know that every time I close my eyes, I feel that same suffocating weight, and I hear the sound of the silence from the graveyard, waiting for me to step back inside. I grew up in a quiet, sprawling suburb in rural Pennsylvania, in a house my parents bought for a steal back in 2018. It was a sprawling colonial, tucked behind a thick line of mature oak trees that seemed to swallow the house whole during the summer. I was 19 at the time, home for the summer between college semesters, spending my days working a part-time job and my nights trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. We knew the history of the land when we bought it. The developer had been open about it. The foundation crew had unearthed a series of shallow, unmarked graves during the excavation process. It was ancient stuff, local indigenous history that the Historical Society had documented and then, for the most part, left alone after reinterring what they could. My parents, always the pragmatic, modern types, laughed it off as a historical curiosity. It's just dirt in history, my dad used to say. I didn't think much of it then either. The unease didn't start with a bang. It was a slow, creeping accumulation of small, wrong things. It was the way the floorboards in the hallway would creak in a sequence that sounded like footsteps, even when everyone else was out of the house. It was the sudden, dead silences that would fall over the kitchen, where even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to cut out entirely, leaving my ears ringing. I spent a lot of time in my bedroom, a large, drafty space at the end of the long upstairs hallway. The first incident I really couldn't rationalize happened on a Tuesday night, probably around 9:30 p.m. I was alone upstairs, getting ready to head out to a friend's place. I was standing in the middle of my room, shirtless, pulling on a clean hoodie. My bedroom door was cracked open about 4 inches, just enough to let the light from the hallway spill in. As I pulled the fabric over my head, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I watched, paralyzed, as the door moved inward, agonizingly slow, hinges silent. A head peeked around the frame. It was a woman. She was impossibly tall, her skin the color of curdled milk, and her hair was a thick, matted curtain of midnight black that seemed to soak up the light around her. She didn't look like someone who had just walked into the wrong room. She looked like she belonged to the shadows themselves. She was peering into my room with a predatory, detached curiosity. The moment our eyes locked, she didn't blink or scream. She just retracted. It was a fluid, unnatural motion, like a film being played in reverse. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I shoved it open and peered into the hallway. It was empty. The floorboards didn't groan, and the air was still and cold. I walked down the length of the hall, my breath catching in my throat, until I reached the living room stairs. My parents and my younger brother were sitting on the sofa, the glow of the television flickering across their faces. "Did anyone walk through the upstairs hall?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and shaky. My dad didn't even look up from the news. "No." "Why?" "You see a ghost?" I just stood there, the hair on my arms standing up. I went back to my room, locked the door, and spent the rest of the night listening to the silence of the house. The second and final incident was much worse. I had been having trouble sleeping, mostly because the house seemed to vibrate at night. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythmic, subtle shuddering of the bed frame, as if something heavy were pacing underneath the floorboards. I'd grown used to it, dismissing it as the house settling, but that night, the atmosphere felt charged, heavy with the smell of damp earth and rot. I was dead to the world until I felt it, a sudden, sharp, white-hot agony in my right shoulder. It was excruciating, a sensation of pressure and tearing that lasted for several long, agonizing seconds. I jolted awake, gasping, my hand flying to my shoulder. There was nothing there. I was alone in my locked bedroom. I shook it off, convinced I had just experienced a vivid, nightmarish hallucination brought on by stress. The next morning, I felt fine. But after a quick breakfast, I went into the bathroom to shower. I stripped off my shirt and looked into the vanity mirror. I froze. There, right on the fleshy part of my shoulder, was a massive, mottled bruise. It was purple and yellow, spreading across my skin like a stain. I leaned in, my face inches from the glass. I could see the distinct, curved pattern of teeth, small, sharp, and tightly packed. It was a bite mark, deep and bruising into the tissue. I stared at it, the realization washing over me that I hadn't been dreaming at all. I had been locked in that room, the door bolted from the inside, and yet, I hadn't been alone. I moved out of the house 3 weeks later. I never told my parents the truth about the mark. One told them I'd fallen off my bike in the dark. They still live there. Every time I call them, I find myself listening to the background noise, waiting for that telltale silence to return, wondering what is still pacing beneath their feet, waiting for them to sleep. I've lived in this small, quiet corner of Alaska my entire life. It's the kind of town where the biggest news usually involves the high school football team or a new pothole on Main Street. My backyard borders a local cemetery, a well-maintained, peaceful stretch of land that slopes gently down to the banks of the Susquehanna River. When I was 17, I didn't care about the headstones or the history. To me, it was just a shortcut to the river, a place where the water moved slow and the bass were plentiful. I was a skeptic by nature. If I couldn't touch it, measure it, or see it in broad daylight, I didn't believe in it. I had spent countless nights walking through those rows of granite markers, listening to the crickets and the rustle of the trees. It was just geography. That humid July evening, my best friend, Mark, and I decided to head down for some night fishing. It was around 9 p.m., the sky a deep, bruised purple. We were walking along the paved cemetery path, our tackle boxes clinking softly, when we saw him. He was standing right at our usual spot on the bank. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, dressed in an era that felt completely out of sync with the modern world. He wore a brimmed, felt hat pulled low, a heavy gray flannel shirt despite the summer heat, and a worn-out fishing vest loaded with pockets. He stood perfectly still, facing the water. "Hey, look," Mark whispered, nudging my arm. "Guess we'll have to find a different spot. Don't want to crowd him." I nodded. "Let's just go up and ask if he minds if we fish a few yards down. Seems like a local guy." We walked toward him, our footsteps muffled by the grass. We had a clear line of sight, seeing him from the knees up. There was no one else around. The park was silent. I remember the specific texture of his flannel shirt and the way the moonlight hit the buckles on his vest. We were maybe 30 feet away, closing the distance, when the terrain dipped slightly. For a split second, our view was obscured by the rise in the bank. We crested that tiny hill, ready to say evening, but the spot was empty. My breath hitched. The bank was clear, the grass undisturbed. There was nowhere to hide, no trees large enough to mask a person, and the river was too shallow, 3 feet at most, to hide a man standing in it. If he had stepped into the water, he would have been waist deep, splashing, or walking away. But there was nothing but the current gently lapping against the stones. Mark stopped dead. He turned to me, his face bleached of all color. "Where did he go?" he stuttered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The rational part of my brain was frantically searching for an explanation, a trick of the light, a prank, a hiker, but nothing fit. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened. We didn't fish. We didn't even pack our gear. We just turned around and walked back to my house in a frantic, adrenaline-fueled blur. My parents were away for the weekend, and the house felt cavernous and hollow. We locked the front door, bolted the deadbolt, and retreated to the living room. We sat on the couch, the TV muted, just trying to process what had happened. We sat in that uneasy, vibrating silence for about 5 minutes. Then, from the far end of the house near the kitchen, we heard it. It started as a sharp, rhythmic bang, bang, bang against the wall, like someone slamming a fist into the drywall. Then it transitioned into the unmistakable, wet sound of human hands clapping. It was aggressive, rapid fire, and deafeningly loud. It echoed through the hallway with a terrifying, rhythmic intensity. It lasted for a solid 20 seconds, echoing as if the house were nothing but a hollow drum. We didn't move. We didn't speak. I felt paralyzed, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the noise. We stayed in the living room until sunrise, lights blazing in every room, too terrified to move, too terrified to leave. The next day, my stepfather came home from work and went straight to the garage to tinker with his old radio. Not 10 minutes later, he came inside, confused. He told us he had unplugged the unit weeks ago and moved it to the attic. He'd walked in to find it sitting on his workbench, turned on and cranked to maximum volume. It wasn't playing music. It was nothing but a harsh, grating wall of static that made your teeth ache. He moved it to the attic again, swearing it was a prank, but he looked unsettled. I never told him what we heard that night. I never told anyone else, except Mark. I still live in this town. I still see things, sometimes shadows that hold their shape a second too long, figures in the periphery that vanish when I turn my head. I've tried to convince myself that my mind is playing tricks, that grief or stress is warping my perception. But the fishing man, the sound of those hands clapping in my empty house, that wasn't a trick. And as I sit here now, sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear the faint, rhythmic sound of applause coming from the walls, waiting for me to acknowledge it.